How to sew the Schoolhouse blocks. This is part of the Amber Makes Sampler Quilt Block of the Month. It's available in two colourways, China Blues and Country Garden. This is a really popular block and a really useful one to add to your quilt. Cutting out. Take the panel out of your kit, and if you have a look at it, you can see all the pieces have the fabric number listed above them. So to make sure that you cut the right pieces from the right fabric. So cut out around the edge of each of them, but make sure you keep the label on the edge. You can cut through the white fabric that separates them. You'll also have some plain fabric in your kit as well. Now you can see here I've cut out all of the pieces with a little bit of white fabric around the edge and the number of the fabric above. It just stops things getting confused, and you'll trim those off later. Now in order to do all the cutting out, you need to subcut. So I'm going to show you here, this is fabric 5. You can cut them in whatever order you want, and the cutting details are all in the instructions. So if you have a look at the fabric 5 cutting out instructions, you'll see that you need to cut it into strips. So start by just trimming off the left-hand edge like this, and that just gives you a nice straight edge to start with, and we've included enough fabric to allow for trimming off an edge. It just gives you a nice neat size. This is a long piece of fabric, and you need to start by cutting a 3.5 inch strip. So if you take your ruler and line up the 3.5 inch mark on the edge, and then cut that 3.5 inches along the whole length of the strip, and you're cutting from side to side, so make sure that when you cut, that number is on the top and you cut from side to side. Next you need to cut a 1.5 inch strip all the way along the length from side to side, and then you need to cut another 1.5 inch strip. So again, line up the 1.5 inch mark on your ruler with the cut edge of the fabric, and you're cutting from side to side. If you always make sure you cut so that the fabric number is at the top, and you always cut from side to side, then everything will work. And that piece is spare, you don't need that, but you can just keep that for other items. So now let's take the 3.5 inch strip, and in the instructions it will tell you that you need to subcut it. So start by laying it so it's in a straight line along your cutting mat, and then just trim off the very edge so that you've got a nice straight right angled edge to start with. By laying it straight along the mat, you can be sure of that. Then you can subcut it into the pieces listed in the instructions. So I'm going to start off by cutting a 1.5 inch strip, and now I've got one piece that's 3.5 by 1.5. Follow the cutting instructions to cut out the rest of the fabric in the same way. So that's all the fabric 5 pieces cut out, and then pin a label to them. You can just write these out onto a scrap of paper or photocopy the cutting instructions and cut those out. Then organise them into groups. You'll be making 3 different schoolhouse blocks, so organise them into groups. All of the cutting out instructions give you the names. So there's large schoolhouse block, mirrored schoolhouse block, and then the small schoolhouse blocks. So if you make sure that you write the name as you cut them out, then you can organise them into sections. So I've sorted out all of my print fabrics here and kept them in 3 different piles. Then you need to cut the background fabric, and again there's lots of little pieces for this, so just trim them and label them following the instructions. Again, you'll be cutting strips and then subcutting them. That's all your 3 blocks ready, and you can now start assembling your quilt blocks. How to snowball a corner. A snowballing corner is used a lot in these blocks, so I'm going to show you the method here. It's how you cut off a corner without having to use triangles. So take one of the fabrics of the background fabric here and draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other on the wrong side, and place this right sides facing with the other piece of fabric. The instructions will tell you which fabrics to place together and where to draw the line, but this is just the method that you use. Pin either side of it and then sew along that drawn diagonal line. Once you've done that, before you trim it, fold one fabric piece over so that it meets the corner. You might need to pull it slightly if you haven't sewn perfectly accurately, but this just makes it more accurate. And then trim off the seam allowances by folding that top layer back. Just trim them to 1/4 inch wide. And then fold it over and just press it again. You've now snowballed the corner, which creates an angle and is a much easier way to do it than using triangles. So this is the method you'll use throughout the blocks. Let's start by making the large schoolhouse block, and we're going to start with making the chimney section. So take all the pieces that you've put to one side before for the large schoolhouse block and arrange them into piles for each section. So you can see I've got them in the piles for the roof and the chimney and all the different places. Then you can make one section at a time. So move all those other pieces to one side, and we'll start by making the chimney section. So you need to lay out the fabrics in order: section A, section B, section C, section D and section E. You've labelled them all so you know which they are. And then sew these all together in a row. Take off the labels just before you pin them together, and then you won't forget. And you'll notice as you're making these blocks that all the sections are labelled with letters in order, so it makes it a lot easier when you're making the whole thing that you're sewing it with the label. So just take off the label and pin it together. I found it easier to pin all of these pieces together in a row and then sew them, but obviously you can pin and sew and then pin and sew. But you'll see these are all alternated, so just always check before you sew them together that you've got them in the right order. In the instructions, there are diagrams of this as well, which you can refer to if you prefer, and then you can make sure everything is going in the right order. So once you've pinned them together, sew all of those pieces together, and then they will look like this. And I've pressed the seam allowances over towards the chimneys. Now you can put that to one side, ready for the next section. Making the roof section. Take all the pieces that you've put to one side for the roof, and then we're going to make one little piece at a time because there's lots of angles in this roof. So we'll start by making section F. So place the background fabric section F right sides facing on top of section F and snowball the corner. Next we're going to make section H, which is made in two parts. So you've got the two print fabrics and the background fabric. So place one of the section H pieces on top of the background fabric, but draw a line to start with from the top right to the bottom left hand corner. Remember you're drawing this on the wrong side as I showed you in the snowballing instructions, and line up the left hand side and the top and the bottom. So the left hand, the raw edges, so you can see that's on the left, and then pin it either side and snowball the corner as I showed you previously. Once that's done, you've angled that corner. Now take the other print fabric square and draw a diagonal line from the top right to the bottom left. Place that on top of the background fabric square, matching up the right hand side and the top and the bottom. And then pin it into place and snowball the corner. This is a really easy way of getting the angle into this piece that forms the roof without having to cut triangles, and it's much more accurate as well. So sew along that line to snowball the corner, and then section H will look like that. And then you make section I by snowballing the two pieces together. So place the background fabric right sides facing onto the print fabric and draw a diagonal line from the top left to the bottom right. Make sure all the raw edges are matching up when you do this, and pin away from the line, and then you can keep the pins in place as you sew, which will keep it more steady. So that's section I finished. Now you can take all the sections that you've made and you can make the roof. So you've got section F, section G is just one piece that you haven't had to do anything with. Then you've got H and I. Join them all together in a straight line by doing one seam at a time. And then this is what the roof section will look like, and you can put that to one side for now. Making the windows section. To start off, make the windows by sewing these pieces together, J, K, L, M and N in a row. If you take off the labels just as you sew them in place, you'll get them in the right order, and then press the seams over to one side. Now take section O and sew that above the windows, and sew section P below the windows. Again, place them right sides facing and sew together with the section with the seamed uppermost, so that's the window section, and then it will look like this. Then you sew Q above O, and once that's done, take section R, which is that background fabric piece, and sew that to the right hand side. And then it will look like this, and that's the windows section complete. So just put that to one side for now. Making the door section. Take the pieces for the door, so you've got S, T and U, and sew those right sides facing in order. When you've done that, press the seams over to one side. I've pressed them towards the print fabric. Now take section V and sew that to the top of the door. Place it right sides facing and sew with the seam door section uppermost, and that means that when you sew it into place you won't twist the seams that you've pressed over to one side. And that's the door section complete, ready to add to your schoolhouse. Assembling the block. Now you've made all the sections, you can join them together, so lay them out in the order just so you can see what goes where. And we're going to start by joining the windows to the door. So join the right hand side of the windows section to the left hand side of the door and place them so they're right sides facing. Pin them into place either end. That just makes sure that they will match up exactly at the top and the bottom. And then making sure that the raw edges match, pin between. There are no seams to match up when you're joining these pieces. And then sew them together. So that's the windows and the door, and I press the seam to one side. Now we're going to take the roof section and join that on. There are a few seams to match up here, so I'm going to put them on my pressing mat so I can pin into them. So place the roof right sides facing on top of the windows and door. Pin them together at one end. And then there are a couple of seams you need to match up. So if you push your pin 1/4 of an inch down from the top, through the top fabric, and then make sure that pin goes through the seam below it. And just push that in vertically, which is why I'm doing it on my pressing mat. And then place another pin on the next seam, 1/4 of an inch down from the top, and push it into the seam. Those are the only two seams you need to match up here. So pin it together at the other end. It's really important that both side edges match up. And before you remove those vertical placement pins, push a pin diagonally through the seams, and then you can remove that. And now you can be sure that those two seams match up exactly. Once you've pinned the two ends and you've matched the seams, then you can pin between. You might need to just pull the fabric a little bit, because when you've got one piece of fabric that has more seams than other, it pulls it in slightly. So if you just anchor your fabric by pushing a pin through it and into the mat, you can then pull the other fabric just gently to make it fit, and then sew those two pieces together. And now the roof is attached to the windows and the doors, and I press that seam open. Now take the chimney section and place that right at the top of the house. Place it right sides facing, and you've got a few more seams to match up here. So in the same way as before, place your vertical pin 1/4 of an inch down from the top on the top piece, and then make sure the pin comes through right into the seam at the bottom piece. So push it through the seam on the top piece and into the seam on the bottom piece. And then when you're sewing, because you'll be sewing 1/4 of an inch from the top, you can be sure that these will then match exactly. So I'm making sure it matches in there, and then I'm going to pin that into place on the left-hand edge. Because it's more important than matching the seams is making sure that the side edges match up, otherwise your block will look a bit wonky. If your seams don't match up 100% perfectly, it really doesn't matter. It's supposed to be a handmade block, not a printed one. So there will be errors and irregularities, and that's the beauty of making your own blocks. But make sure the sides match up, that's quite important. So I like to put plenty of pins in. I find it a lot easier when sewing that I haven't got to adjust anything if I pin everything together, making sure the raw edges match, and then I can just sew it and remove the pins as I go, and I don't have to do any adjusting of fabric whilst it's under the machine. That's why using a mat or an ironing board is really useful here, because then you can pin it into place. Then sew it together, and that's the actual schoolhouse section of the block complete. Now to make it the correct size, we're going to add some borders. So take the top border and pin that right size facing along the top, but flip it over so that you're sewing with the schoolhouse on top. And that's because this is the place with all the seams, and you want to make sure that all those seams that you've carefully pressed either over to one side or you've pressed open stay like that. So pin it at either end, and again, because you're pinning a border fabric with no seams to a piece of fabric with seams, you will need to pull it slightly. So push a pin in to anchor it and then pull the other end. And then I like to just, once everything is nice and even, I just pop vertical pins in. That holds it all in place, and then you can just lift it up, and those vertical pins you can then just push back in through all the fabrics. But that just makes sure that the border is sitting evenly. So sew the top border into place, and then repeat this to sew the bottom border to the bottom edge in exactly the same way, remembering to work with the seamed piece uppermost. Once that's done and you've got your top border attached and your bottom, I press those over to one side. Then you can take the two side borders, and these are sewn either side of the block. Again, make sure that you place them right sides facing down each side, and when you sew them into place, sew them with the seamed piece, so the schoolhouse block piece uppermost, and that just stops you twisting any seams. Once that's done, your large schoolhouse block is now complete, ready to put for one side for when you assemble your quilt at the very end. Now we can make the mirrored schoolhouse block. We'll start by making the chimney section, but take all the pieces that you put to one side for the mirrored schoolhouse block and then arrange them into piles so you've got one for each of the sections that we're going to make. Then it's easier when you're doing the whole block if you've got everything together. So just putting all the sections to one side for a moment, let's take all the pieces for the chimney section, and these are labelled the same as the other schoolhouse block, A, B, C, D and E. So lay them all out in this order, and then you can make sure they're the right way round as well. Take off the labels as you sew them together, and then sew them one by one together in a line. When that's done, I press the seams towards the chimneys, and then just put that to one side for now. Now we can make the roof section, so take all the pieces that you put aside for the roof and we'll make them one section at a time. So to make section F, take the BF section F and the normal print section F. You need to snowball this piece, so draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of the BF section F from the top right to the bottom left. And then place that right sides facing on top of the section F fabric piece. Make sure you match up all the raw edges and pin together either side of the line, but place your pins a little distance away so that you can keep them in place while you're sewing. And then sew along the drawn line and snowball the corner as explained in the instructions at the beginning, and that's section F complete. Just put the piece of paper back on top of that. Now to make section G, this is made in two parts. This creates the angled section of the roof, the main angled section. So you need to take one of the print section G squares and draw a diagonal line on that from the top left to the bottom right. Remember, all of these details are in your instructions as well, so if you prefer to read them and double check what you're doing as well as watching the video, then do refer to the instructions. Place that right sides facing on top of the BF piece, and make sure you match up the left hand raw edge and then the top and bottom raw edges, and then sew along the line, press it and trim the seam allowance, and then you can do the other part of this section G. So draw a diagonal line from the top left to the bottom right, and then place this print square right sides facing on top of the background fabric, making sure you match up the top, bottom and right hand raw edges. Once everything's matching up, then you can pin it together, sew along the draw line and snowball the corner. And then it will look like that, and that's section G done. So just put the label back on top. And then to do section I, take the section I, BF section I, and then section I print square, and place them right sides facing. You can take the labels off while you're doing this, and draw a line on the BF square from the top left to the bottom right. Just double check as you're doing this that you're always drawing the lines in the right direction, and then everything will work out as you do it. So there are diagrams in the instructions, so I would say after you've watched the video, just have a quick look at the diagrams just to make sure that you are drawing your lines and sewing in the right way. So that's section I complete. Now you can construct the whole roof. So take section F, section G. H is just one piece of fabric that hasn't been snowballed, and then I at the end, and join them all together in a line. And then that's the roof section. It will look like this. I've pressed all my seams over to one side so it's nice and neat, ready for putting into the house. Making the door section. Take the 4 pieces that you've put aside for the door, and we'll start by making the door itself. So put section J, section K and section L in a line. So you can see the background fabric is sandwiched between the 2 doors posts. So the background fabric's the door and those are the sides of the door. Sew those together and then sew the top of the door section, which is section M, above the door. Turn it over so that you are sewing with the piece side uppermost so that you don't twist the seam allowances, and then press it all. I've pressed mine to one side. That's the door section complete. Making the window section. So take all the pieces that you put aside for the window section. We'll start by making the windows and the window frames. So lay out in order section N, section O, section P, section Q and then section R. Make sure they're all facing the right way up because they're all going to be the same height, and sew them together in a row so that you're alternating the print and the background fabric, and then press the seams over to one side. Now take section S and sew that above the assembled windows, making sure that you place it right sides facing, matching raw edges and with the pieced window section uppermost, and then sew section T in the same way below the assembled windows, again with the pieced fabric uppermost so that you don't twist the seams. When that's done, I see I've pressed all of my seams now. Take section U and sew that above S. Once you've sewn that, take section V and sew this to the left-hand side of these assembled pieces. Make sure that you do sew them in this order, referring to the diagrams as well, because remember this is the mirrored block, so it is the opposite way round to the large schoolhouse block. Assembling the mirrored block. So take all the sections that you've made and lay them out in order so you can see what goes where. And we'll start by joining the door and the windows together. I'm putting these on my pressing mat just because then I can pin them together and hold them in place. So you're joining the right-hand side of the door section to the left-hand side of the windows. So pin them together at either end because it's important that the side raw edges match up, and then you can pin together between. I just find it easier when I'm pinning 2 fabric pieces, particularly if they're a little bit, not really long, but a little bit long like this, then you can pin them into the mat. Once that's done, press the seam over to one side and then take the roof section. Now there are a couple of seams that need to match up on here. So place the 2 pieces right sides facing and pin them together at one end to start with, just to make sure that those short edges match up. And then to match up the seams, push your vertical pin 1/4 inch from the top through the seam, and then make sure that pin comes into the seam in the fabric below, and then just leave it anchored there for now. And then match up the next seam in the same way and push it into your mat, or it can be your ironing board, and then pin the other short end. So now that the short ends match up and everything's anchored, you can then pull it out of the mat slightly, but keeping the pin in place, and then place a diagonal pin that goes all through across, and then that holds those pinned seams together. And you can then pin between the side raw edges and the anchor point. So if you're trying to get something to match up, always make sure that the sides match up, then do the seams that need to match up, and then you can pin between. And if you find that one piece, because it has less seams, doesn't fit as well across the piece below, then just pull it very slightly to ease it into place. And then sew it, and I've pressed that seam open because there was more bulk there. And then finally take the chimney piece and place that right sides facing, and again using the same method to make sure these seams match up. Pin it together at one side. I usually like to work from one end, pin the side in place, and then pin the seams in order going from one side to the other, just because it's easier to be able to lift them up to see beneath. If you don't pin it, if you pin it at either end first, it's a little bit harder to lift it up and see below. And then pin match that final seam, and then you can pin the side raw edges to make sure they match up. and then pin across the seams, and then you can remove those vertical anchoring pins. And then pin the section between. So because that section of the chimney is just a non-pieced piece of fabric, it doesn't fit as well across the roof, so that's why I've just pushed a vertical pin in to anchor the fabric, and then I can just pull it slightly to ease it to fit. Then stitch it into place, and that's the mirrored schoolhouse block section finished. So all you need to do now is add the borders. So take the top border, sew it right sides facing from the top, but remembering to work with the pieced schoolhouse piece uppermost, and then put the bottom border across the bottom, making sure that those seams don't get twisted as you sew over them. Press the seams either open or over to one side, and then take the two side borders and pin and sew one to the right hand side, working with the schoolhouse block uppermost, and then pin and sew the other side border to the left hand side. Once that's done, you can give it a good press, and it will look like this, and your mirrored schoolhouse block is now complete. Now we can make the small schoolhouse block. So we're going to start by making small schoolhouse 1, and just with the other two, we make the chimney section first. What you need to do first is put all of the pieces for each of the small schoolhouses in piles. Everything is labelled with all the different numbers for them, 1, 2, 3 and 4. And the background fabric pieces for them are the same for each one. So you've got multiples of these, you either use 1 or 2 of each in them. So put all of the other 3 piles to one side so that we can just start on small schoolhouse 1. And again, like with the large ones, I've organised these into sections so that I can make one section at a time. So I'm going to start by making the chimney section. So the background fabric pieces are shared, so you'll have more than one. So just take one of those section A off, and then pin the rest of them together. You'll use those for the other small schoolhouses. And then you need B, then you need one piece of C. So again, take one off your pile, pin the label back on so that you remember what letter they are, and put that to one side. Then you'll need a print piece D, and then a background fabric piece E. And again, take one piece off your pile and pin the label back on, otherwise you won't remember when you're doing the next one. And then sew those all together in a line, A, B, C, D and E, taking the labels off as you go. And then once that's done, press the seams, and that's the chimney section for small schoolhouse 1 complete. Making the roof section. So the roof section is made slightly differently for this small schoolhouse because it's small. It's a bit too fiddly to do it in the same way. So I've simplified this to make these roofs easier to do. So you'll need 2 of your background fabric section F pieces, and then your 1 print piece. So draw a diagonal line on one of the background fabric pieces from the top right to the bottom left. It doesn't matter which way you draw it on the background fabric, it's the way that you place it. So top right to bottom left. So match up the top and the side raw edges and pin that into place. And then you can snowball that side of the roof. This is just creating the 2 angles on the roof. And then draw a diagonal line on the other background fabric section F piece. And then pin that to the other side of the roof, matching up the top and right hand side. So you can see that angle goes from the top left to the bottom right. So you can see that that's creating the roof shape. Because it's a much smaller schoolhouse, simplifying the roof makes it a lot easier. Otherwise there were too many seams and it was too tricky. So sew along those lines and then snowball the corners, and then that is the roof section of this small schoolhouse finished. Making the door section. So to make the door section, you need a print section G and then a background fabric section H. So take one of those off your pile, and don't forget to pin the label back on, and then you'll know which is which because you'll use these for the other 3 small schoolhouses. So that's section H. You'll need the print section I. Now sew these together right sides facing into a row to create the door. So the background fabric is the door and the two front pieces are the sides of the door. Sew those together and then it will look like that. And I've pressed the fabric towards the print. Then take section J, which is a print fabric section, and place that along the top edge of the door. Make sure that you've got the pieced door section uppermost so that those seams don't get twisted over. And when they're such little pieces, it's quite important that they lay flat. And sew that together for the top of the door. And then give it a press. And that completes the door section for your small schoolhouse. Making the windows section. So take all the pieces that you put to one side for the window section. So you'll need section K, which is print. You'll need a section L, which is one of the backgrounds. So don't forget to pin the label back on of the other three pieces. You'll need a section M of the print, a section N. Again, this is one of your background fabrics. So take one off the pile and then pin the others back together. And then a print section O. So place them, you're alternating the print and the background fabric to create the windows, and then sew them all together in a row. And then press the seams. I press them inwards over to one side towards the background fabric. Then take section P and sew that above the assembled windows. So make sure that you pin and sew with the window section uppermost to keep those seams pressed over. And then sew section Q below the windows so that you're sewing fabric above and below the windows. Once that's done, it will look like this. Then take section R, which is one of your background fabrics. So again, take one off the pile and then pin the other three back together. And then so once that's sewn into place, you can then take section S, one of the background fabric pieces, and sew that to the left-hand side of all your assembled pieces. When that's done, it will look like this, and that's your whole windows section complete and ready for your house. Assembling the schoolhouse. So take all the sections that you've made and we can sew them all together in order to create the schoolhouse. So start by joining the door to the windows. So join the right hand side of the door section to the left hand side of the windows. So place the two pieces right sides facing. Pin them together at either side first so that you make sure that the side raw edges match up. Especially when I'm dealing with a piece like this where there's lots of small pieces, I always place this on my board, anchor everything with vertical pins, and then you can make sure that everything is evenly placed in laying flat, and then pin it together and sew those two pieces together. When it's done, that's the doors and the windows attached. So now you can take the roof and join that on top. So place them right sides facing, and I'm turning it over so that the door and windows are uppermost as that's got the most seams. But there aren't actually any seams to match up with this one because the roof isn't as pieced as when you made the large schoolhouse block and the mirror schoolhouse block, just to make it a bit simpler. So anchor it at one end and then just pull the top fabric gently. It just opens out the seams because when you sew the pieces together with the seams, it pulls the fabric in slightly. So you're not actually stretching the fabric, you're just opening up the seams because the pieces are exactly the same size, so they will fit, but you'll sometimes need to ease them slightly. But to make sure you do that evenly, always anchor it at either end. And then once you've pinned the roof to the doors and the windows, sew that into place and press the seam either open or to one side. Now take the chimney section, and this is the piece that you will need to match up a couple of seams. So pin it into place at the end, making sure those side raw edges match up. And now you can match up the seams. So push your pin 1/4 inch from the top through the seam, and then make sure that pin comes through the seam below 1/4 inch below, because you'll be sewing with your 1/4 inch seam allowance if you match them at the 1/4 inch mark, and you can just guess that. You don't really need to measure it. It's just as long as it 1/4 inch from the top. If you match it up there, then it will match it up even if you sew a little bit above it, or if you don't get it exactly right, it's enough to match it. Once you've matched the seams, place diagonal pins, and then you can remove those holding pins. And then you'll need to hold it at one end just to pull it slightly, only because that section in the chimneys is a longer section, so you might need to pull that to open the seams and ease it a little bit. Sew it together, and then that's small schoolhouse one complete. Now 2, 3 and 4 are made in exactly the same way. They have different print fabrics, but they share the same background fabrics. Do make one at a time, just because it's easy to get the prints mixed up otherwise. And if you want to have the same arrangement as we've done here, make one at a time, but following the instructions for schoolhouse one each time. Assembling the block. So take the 4 schoolhouses that you've made, and we're going to join them together with sashing strips. So to make the top row, you've got schoolhouse 1 on the left, then a sashing strip, and then schoolhouse 2 on the right. So start by sewing the sashing strip right sides facing to the right hand side of schoolhouse 1, but make sure that you've got schoolhouse 1 uppermost, because that has the most seams in it. And then you can make sure that as you're sewing over those seams that you keep them either pressed open or the side that you've pressed them. So pin it into place either end to match the shawl wrought edges. And then once you've pinned that into place, then sew the left hand side of schoolhouse 2 to the other side, and in the same way join 3 and 4 together with the sashing strip between. So you've got 3 on the left and 4 on the right, and then you've got the top row with the sashing strip between, and then you've got the bottom row with the sashing strip between. Now to join all of these together, take the top border and sew that right sides facing along the top edge of schoolhouse 1 and 2, and then sew the middle border to the bottom edge of schoolhouse 1 and 2. Remember to place them right sides facing and always sew from the side with all the seams. Once it's done, it will look like this. So there's the top and the middle border joined to schoolhouse 1 and 2. Now take schoolhouse 3 and 4 and join them to the bottom of the middle border, again with the seams uppermost. And then when you've sewn that into place, you can take the bottom border and sew that to the bottom edge. So once you've sewn them all together, then you will have all the 4 schoolhouses joined together with sashing and borders in between them. So all that's left to finish it is to sew a side border to each side. These are just long pieces, so there's no seam matching to do. But because they're a bit longer, and also because they're narrow, I find to make sure that you place them correctly, if you fold the side border in half and find the midpoint, then match that up with the middle of that middle border. You can either measure that or fold it. It just helps when you're pinning a long piece like that to get it in place. Once that's done, press it all. I've pressed my seams over to one side. You can press them open if you prefer. And that's your small schoolhouse block finished. You've done all 3 blocks. Well done.